Okay, let's jump right into this explainer and build what we like to call the trust equation. If you've ever stopped to wonder why you can confidently invest your hard-earned money into massive, incredibly complex corporations, well, the answer really comes down to external auditors. They act as the ultimate guardians of market trust. So today, we're going to unpack exactly how that whole system works, from the legal standards to the professional ethics keeping it all together. Think of an auditor's role like a giant magnifying glass. It requires this immense, totally objective investigation to uncover the actual financial truths of a business. They're not just taking a quick glance at a balance sheet and calling it a day. Oh no, they are meticulously inspecting the granular details to make sure the numbers perfectly align with reality. It's a massive responsibility, and as you'd expect, it's governed by some highly specific rules. So, here is our roadmap for the explainer. We'll quickly cover the core purpose of external audits, dig into the legal rights and duties, map out those crucial ethical boundaries, look at the real-world stakes of negligence, break down the science of materiality, and finally, we'll decode the all-important audit risk. Right, let's start with the foundation. We need to establish exactly why these financial investigations even exist in the first place. A really crucial starting point here is drawing a hard, bright line between internal and external audits, because it clears up a very common misconception. Internal audits are all about looking inward, right? They're done by staff within the organization to improve systems and fix operational hiccups. But external audits, they look purely outward. They're performed by totally independent experts with one massive goal in mind: giving confidence to outsiders, like investors, banks, and governments, that the organization's financial reporting can actually be relied upon.
Building on that foundation, let's shift over to the strict legal framework that actually gives auditors their power. Because let's face it, you can't just stroll into a corporate headquarters and demand to see their private financial records without the law backing you up.
And this is where the Rwanda Companies Act 2021 comes into play. It specifically arms auditors with the legal teeth they need to do their jobs. Take Article 134, for example. That legally guarantees them unhindered access to accounting records at all times. They can literally demand explanations straight from the directors. But in exchange for that awesome power, Article 135 dictates a heavy duty. They must report to the shareholders on whether those financial statements show a true and fair view. Plus, Article 136 actually gives them a voice to speak at general shareholders meetings. It's really this perfect, delicate balance of absolute authority and absolute accountability.
But having the legal right to audit isn't quite enough. We need a moral compass. Because if an auditor has all that legal power but totally lacks ethical grounding, the entire trust equation just collapses overnight.
So think of the 5 ICPAR fundamental principles not as boring rules, but as an impenetrable shield keeping the auditor's opinion pure. You've got integrity, which just means being completely straightforward and honest. Objectivity, which strips away any bias or conflict of interest. Professional competence and due care ensures the auditor actually has the up-to-date skills required for the job. Confidentiality is absolutely paramount. Client data is locked down tight. And professional behavior simply means obeying the law and upholding the reputation of the profession. These 5, they are completely non-negotiable.
Of course, we have to ask ourselves, what forces are actively trying to compromise this objectivity in the real world? Because independence isn't just a state of mind, it's also about how you appear to a reasonable third party looking in.
From accepting lavish gifts to being flat-out bullied by management, auditors have to constantly evaluate and mitigate a bunch of very real threats. A self-interest threat might mean an auditor secretly owns shares in the client's company. No way that works, right? A self-review threat happens if they're forced to basically grade their own firm's previous work. Advocacy turns the auditor into a cheerleader for the client. Familiarity creeps in when an auditor becomes way too chummy with a long-term client and totally loses their professional skepticism. And finally, intimidation, which is exactly what it sounds like, when a client literally pressures or coerces the auditor into altering their findings.
Okay, let's shift gears for a second and look at the real-world consequences if an auditor's moral compass actually fails. What are the stakes when they get it wrong?
Well, if an auditor messes up, an injured party can absolutely sue them. But they have to successfully prove 3 very specific steps under the tort of negligence. It's not enough to just stand up in court and say the auditor made a mistake. First, you got to prove the auditor actually owed you a specific duty of care. Second, you have to prove they breached that duty by acting in a way no reasonably competent auditor ever would. And third, and honestly, this is often the hardest part, you have to prove that this specific breach directly caused your actual financial loss. To put that into perspective, take the 2002 Bank of Scotland versus Bannerman case. It's essentially a financial mini-thriller.
Basically, a company committed fraud, the auditors completely missed it, and so the bank sued the auditors. And guess what? The judge actually ruled in favor of the bank. Why? Because the auditors knew the bank was explicitly relying on those audited accounts to approve an overdraft facility, and the auditors failed to issue a disclaimer. It's a really stark reminder of how an auditor's liability can stretch far beyond the company directly to third parties.
Leaving the courtroom behind us, let's move into the actual science of auditing. How do we decide what errors actually matter? Because let's be real, tracking down every single missing dollar in a billion-dollar company is literally impossible.
This brings us to a huge concept defined in ISA 320, materiality. Basically, if a mistake won't change an investor's mind, it might not be material. It is all about the user's decision-making process. Think of it as a threshold. An error is only considered a material misstatement if it would reasonably influence the economic decisions of the people relying on those financial statements. If fixing a tiny rounding error doesn't change the big picture whatsoever, it's immaterial. We don't sweat it.
So how do they calculate it? It's a highly structured process. You pick a relevant benchmark, like total assets or revenue, and apply a specific percentage based on the perceived risk. For example, if the initial risk is deemed high, an auditor might choose a strict threshold, say 1% on $1 million in total assets. That creates a hard quantitative threshold of exactly $10,000. That becomes the anchor for the investigation. Any error over 10 grand requires correction, because at that point it fundamentally alters the financial reality for the user.
But auditors are cautious. To be safe, they don't just wait to find one massive error. They apply what we call a haircut to catch a bunch of smaller cumulative errors before they snowball into a disaster. This is known as performance materiality. So if your overall materiality is 500,000, you don't just set your sights on errors of 500,000. You might set your performance materiality at, say, 400,000. This ensures that a dozen smaller errors of 40,000 don't just fly under the radar, group together, and suddenly result in a massively misstated financial report. It's a safety net.
Which leads us perfectly to the final and perhaps most crucial piece of the trust equation, managing audit risk.
In plain terms, audit risk is the absolute nightmare scenario for an auditor. It's the risk that they sign off on a report saying everything is true and fair, when in reality, it's full of material lies or errors. It's giving the green light to a train wreck. And since we just learned that auditors physically cannot check absolutely everything, this risk can never be exactly zero.
But we can deconstruct this fear into a beautiful, simple little formula, the audit risk model. It states that audit risk equals inherent risk times control risk times detection risk. AR equals IR times CR times DR. This equation is exactly how an auditor scientifically plans their entire engagement. They assess the different types of risk up front and then adjust their own behavior to make sure the final audit risk stays at an acceptably low level, usually around that 5% mark.
Now, look at how these three risk levers interact. Inherent risk is just the nature of the beast. Is the industry incredibly complex? Are the transactions highly unusual? Control risk is entirely on the client. Did their internal accounting systems completely fail to catch an error? The auditor has absolutely zero power to change inherent or control risk. They can only measure them. But detection risk? That's the risk that the auditor's own procedures miss the error, and that lever is entirely in the auditor's hands. If inherent and control risks are sky high, the auditor must drop the detection risk by increasing their sample sizes, digging deeper, and testing far more aggressively.
And that brings us full circle. As we wrap up this explainer, remember that while all these laws, these strict ethics, and these clever formulas build immense market trust, perfect certainty is a total myth. Audit risk is never zero. We've seen how the Rwanda Companies Act grants the power, how the ICPAR code mandates the integrity, and how materiality and risk models scientifically limit the errors. But at the end of the day, an audit is a human endeavor, providing reasonable, not absolute assurance. It leaves us to ponder, in a financial system built entirely on trust, how do we navigate those remaining unknowns? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into the architecture of financial trust. See you in the next explainer.